Hello. Um, this is something I've touched on before, but I really do think it is something that can't be emphasized enough. And it's something that those of us who follow the sport of boxing, whether you are a casual fan, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, or you're a more in depth fan, whether you like the anthropological side of boxing, i.e., the history of it, or whether you're more interested in the physical side of it, the fitness side of it. Whatever angle you look at boxing at as a fan, I do think this is something that needs to be really reiterated, and that is something that's kind of obvious. At least to me, it is, and that is that boxers fundamentally deserve our respect. Um, Boxing, like every sport, is a business. It involves big money. The sort of super fights we're seeing today are involving figures that guys in the past would never have dreamed of in a super fight. Um, Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, people like that. They were starting to break through the $1 million gate, but the sort of figures we're seeing in the sport now are astronomical. But that's business, and it goes, I guess, with other sports as well. Um, so there is certainly that aspect to it. Hence, you're going to have a situation where there is an inevitable hierarchy within the sport. Some guys are better than others. Um, Therefore, there is going to be debate about, does this guy deserve a title? Does this guy not deserve a title? Does this guy deserve a shot? Does this guy not deserve a shot? And so on. But when we get through all that business side of things, what it fundamentally comes down to is something very ancient, very primeval, and very basic, actually. Single combat between two men and women. Single combat between two people in a ring, right? It's something very, very basic. And it is something that, in some ways, is brutal, in other ways, is pure. And you'll know if you're a boxing fan that it's a sport that's quite difficult to vindicate because non boxing fans just see it as violence. It's just these people getting paid to basically hit each other in the head repeatedly. There's no question about it. There is a brutal side to it, and there is a menacing side to the sport. There is no question about that, especially when you get a certain degree of trash talking going on, and when it gets to a point, and I must admit I don't particularly like that. When it gets to the point where two guys really hate each other, the reason I don't like it is because it's not wrestling. It's not scripted. And that concerns me because you think then they really do want to hurt each other rather than just win the fight. And I don't think that's good for the sport. But every fighter knows there is at least some point they will get hurt. As Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get knocked out. Now, my own experience of the ring is very limited. I've had one amateur fight, and I was unsuccessful. So I can hardly relate to someone who's in the professional game or even more experienced amateurs. I'm fully aware of that, but I followed the sport long enough to develop an interest in the psychology of it, and there's things that I find utterly fascinating, sometimes unsettling, but it's always compelling. I mean, let's look at Froch Groves too. And that's even been surpassed in the UK since then with Joshua versus Klitschko. But in terms of the crowd numbers, this country has seen some huge fight crowds in recent years. Like I say, 90,000 at Joshua Klitschko, 80,000 at Froch Groves too, um, 70,000 at Joshua Takam. So there's been some huge fight crowds. I mean, that to me is an aspect I find very interesting, that crowd dynamic, because a lot of guys will say, oh, fundamentally, there's no difference between fighting man against man in front of one person versus in front of 90,000 people. I find that very hard to believe. I think it was Froch that said we felt like Roman gladiators going in there. We felt like putting sandals on, and he was only half joking. I cannot imagine. I know how I felt going into the ring, and it was a real fight. You know, we weren't messing around, but I had headgear on, and there was about 600 people there, and I could sense that atmosphere. I can't comprehend 80,000. It's I find that utterly fascinating. Um, Last night, George Groves versus Chris Eubank Jr. Manchester. Um, I didn't see the fight with English commentary, but someone's already uploaded it. Has Russian commentary, but nevertheless, you get the even watching the footage. That was a real war, and huge respectable fighters. But that's really the crust of the argument I want to make in this video. If you didn't see the fight, if you don't know, you will have by now. But Groves won on points, and he was fighting in the last round with a dislocated shoulder. Um, what fighters put themselves through is something that I don't think normal people can really appreciate, but it's something that boxing fans should appreciate. And one thing I dislike about the sport is when, and I've touched on this point before, but when you see fans trash talking fighters, it really bugs me because, okay, on one hand, you could argue, well, these guys are being paid a lot of money for what they do. They're doing something they obviously enjoy a lot, otherwise, they wouldn't be putting themselves through it. Um, and they're professional athletes, they train for it, hence, all trash talking from fans is okay. I don't agree with that because it doesn't matter if you're paid 10 million or 50 quid, the risk is always there. And if we're brutally honest as fans, boxing is a dangerous sport. Men have died in the ring. Men have been seriously injured. They've ended up in a very bad way. And every boxing fan will tell you that's depressing. But there is a contradiction because when we hear of that happening, people say, "Oh, you know, condolences, it's awful, etc." Then a lot of the same people will go back a week later, watch the fight, and say, "Oh, this fighter's a bum. Fighter's a tomato can. This fighter's a card." That one really bugs me. Um, and sometimes I feel in a minority with this. I feel like, I'll be quite honest, sometimes I feel almost too civilized for the sport. That sounds a little bit maybe self righteous, but when I see other fans behaving the way they do, it makes me sick. And it does anger me when I see fans calling someone who enters the ring for a living a card. The way I see it is, unless you have done a certain challenge in your life that requires that sort of risk, you have no right to call anybody a card unless you've done it yourself. And even then, if you've done it yourself, this is why I'm sometimes wary of trash talking between fighters. Even if you've done it yourself, there should be a certain degree of empathy there, knowing what it takes. Now, I get it. Boxing is never going to have the genteel nature of tennis or golf or something like that. There's always going to be that warrior aspect to it, and with that inevitably comes a certain degree of trash talking. And I admit, without trash talking, the sport would be boring at times. So you do need a certain degree of hype. You do need a certain degree of trash talking to sell fights. I totally get that. I'm fine with that. But I think there is a red line. And sometimes you see it. Last year, Hey Bellew, I think that crossed the red line. The way that went down in terms of it ended up as a great fight. But the two guys just, it was getting to really quite nasty territory. And I don't take any pleasure from that. I find it depressing. I don't find it appealing at all. Um, then you had Joshua versus Klitschko. Enormous respect between those two guys. Now, I appreciate that you can't have that always in the sport because people would start saying, "Oh, it's getting boring because these guys are too nice to each other." But look at the fight; it was a great fight. It's generally regarded as one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time, and rightly so. Um, but I feel that there has to be a core respect from us, from the fans, from those who observe this, to what these guys put themselves through. Now, obviously, there's a human dynamic in this. If a guy is picking himself up, if he's really trash talking, if he's really vain, and then he does disappoint on the night, then you could argue, maybe with some legitimacy, well, this guy was all talk and look what happened. That's fair enough. But I do think people need to fundamentally respect the fact that what these guys go through is astonishing. And of course, it takes courage at any level. And sometimes I think we overlook the basics of it. We overlook the fact that that's what it takes. Win, lose, or draw, it takes courage to step into the ring, face another man. Psychologically, you know that there's a chance you're going to get hurt. You know there's a chance, at least from your perspective, you're going to be humiliated. And you may well be facing, on top of that, a hostile crowd. Adding to that psychology, and of course, the top fighters will say crowds win fights, and the top fighters have the ability to drown that out. Um, Eubank was saying before the fight that when he was in the fight, I forget the Turkish guy's name, but in Germany, the Turkish fans were saying "Welcome to hell" and stuff. I mean, some I don't like when that sort of ultra nationalism gets into the sport as well. But sometimes I do question: well, am I too civil? Am I too? Is there a contradiction with maybe some of my values? But then I never ever go away from it. I am always compelled by the sport. I still watch fights online. I still buy boxing magazines, and I'm still fascinated by it. But the fundamentals of it need to be respected. So I don't think any fan has a right to call any fighter a card. Here's the thing too: it's all about whether you like the guy or not. I mean, believe me, there's certain fighters I can't stand. I think they're brash. I think they're arrogant. I don't have much time for the personalities. Um, but I still respect that they're doing what they're doing. Take Mayweather, for example. A truly astonishing, outstanding fighter. There's no question about it. One of the greatest of all time, if not the greatest of all time, pound for pound. Um, I don't want much his personality. I don't particularly respect that side of it, having vast wealth and just showing it off. I find that a bit tasteless. But I also respect it's his money and it's his right to do it. Um, I think Mayweather could have done a lot more with his money, helping people. But that's, to be honest, that is purely a personality thing. Now, as a fighter, I have a world of respect for Mayweather. People say his defensive style is running away. That's a lot of crap. People who say that don't know what they're talking about, and they don't understand that the sport of boxing is not a street fight. It's about protect yourself at all times. And yes, it's true that fighters who have that aggressive style, guys like Pacquiao, certainly tend to be crowd favourites. But Mayweather's philosophy is a pretty sensible one. What is appealing or what is inspiring about putting your body through unnecessary punishment to the point where you end up with, say, severe brain damage? There's nothing romantic about that. There's nothing appealing or inspiring about that. And one of the greatest tragedies in the sport of boxing is when you see great fighters, guys like Roy Jones Jr. and there's many other examples who go on well past their time, and there's a range of reasons for that. They've got themselves into financial difficulties and they need the money. They don't know anything else, and there's a range of factors for it. What Mayweather's doing is saying, I've got to the top of the top, and I've done it relatively unscathed. Mayweather sounds, completely coherent. He doesn't sound like your archetypal punch drunk fighter. That's one of the great things, in my opinion, about Mayweather. And in my opinion, that is a good influence. It's good for the sport of boxing to set that as an example because People say it's running. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, this especially comes from Pacquiao fans, and I get irritated by that because I'm a Pacquiao fan. I mean, Pacquiao is a legend, but when I hear other Pacquiao fans say Mayweather won the Chicken of the Year award and etc., it's just garbage, and they do not know what they're talking about. And I have to take myself away from the comment section because it's just manure, to be honest. You also get vitriol from fans. They take fights, they tend to take it very personally. Sometimes there's a nationalistic element. I mean, that was the case with Pacquiao versus Horn. When Horn won controversially, Filipinos were really getting worked up by that. I can sometimes understand controversy. What I don't understand is when people start personalizing it. I mean, anyone, in my opinion, who trolls the private Facebook page of a fighter, or well, not private, but anyone who's threatening a fighter or insulting their family, things like that, you need to get a life. You're a loser. And I have no problem saying that. I think anyone who trolls a fighter in that sort of way is a complete loser. It's a bit different saying, oh, you disappointed us and you know your opponent won, something like that. But there are certain things that shouldn't be crossed. And it does anger me. And it's a side of the sport I admit sometimes puts me off it. On the other hand, there's that ancient compelling aspect that those fundamentals, the courage, the grit, the warrior spirit, it's all there, and it's something that's ancient. It's something that's always been in human nature. It's like a hunter gatherer instinct almost, and I think that's why it's so appealing. It's so fundamental. It's fundamentally rather simple. Sure, different fighters have different training techniques and so on, but the fundamental aspect is rather basic. You put on gloves, you face another man in the ring, and that's something that's somehow very compelling. And it's difficult to explain to those who don't follow the sport. Anyway, I'll round this up. I just want to say huge respect to George Groves. I think he's established himself as one of Britain's greatest super middleweights ever. I think he's overcome adversity to show that. And respect to Eubank Jr. as well. It will be difficult for him. I've no doubt psychologically he's going to be going through a bit of a phase now where he wonders what next. I'm sure there'll be awkward discussions with his father. But Eubank Jr. deserves respect in his own right. I do think he's established his himself as his own man, other than his away from his father. And I think that the fundamental aspect is there. Anyone who watched what those guys done last night and has no respect for either of them, as far as I'm concerned, you're not a real boxing fan. To me, the mark of a real boxing fan is to look at a fighter, whether you like him or not, and appreciate what he goes through in the ring. And that's it's very fundamental to me. Thanks for watching.